الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله. الله أكبر. استغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله. الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. بحول الله وقوته يكون. بسم الله الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم إني أسألك موجبات رحمتك وزعم مغفرتك والنجاة من النار ومن كل بلية والفوز بالجنة والرضوان في داره السلام وجوار نبيك محمد عليه وآله السلام. اللهم ما بنا من نعمة فمنك لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك.
إلا الله وأن محمدا رسول الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح. حي على قد كانت الصلاة. قد كانت الصلاة. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. بحول الله وقوته أقوم وأقعد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. الله أكبر. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة.
على ابن عمك أمير المؤمنين علي بن أبي طالب وصية رسول رب العالمين. السلام عليك وعلى طلعتك الصديقة الطاهرة فاطمة الزهراء سيدة نساء العالمين. السلام عليك وعلى زوجتك الوفية الغراء خديجة القدوة أم المؤمنين. السلام عليك وعلى ولديك الإمامين الحسن والحسين سيدي شباب أهل الجنة. السلام عليك وعلى أئمة المسلمين من ذرية ولدك الحسين علي السجاد ومحمد الباقر وجعفر الصادق وموسى الكاظم وعلي الرضا ومحمد الجواد وعلي الهادي والحسن العسكري وحجة بن الحسن المهدي. السلام عليك يا سيدي يا مولاي يا صاحب الزمان أجل الله تعالى فرجك وسهل الله مخرجك ودخولك وجعلنا من أنصارك وأعوانك ومستشهدين بين يديك. السلام عليكم جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. أحسن.
Give it to Musa. It's Musa's to draw.
Start now. Somewhere.
Oh, sorry.
Well, okay, let's start. Mariam, are you guys ready? No, are you ready to start? Oh, thank you. Tell me when. Salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. We'd like to start the main program with the recitation of Quran by Fatima Zahra. Sorry? Salawat.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وجاءت سيارة فأرسلوا واردهم فأدلى دلوه قال يا بشرى هذا غلام وأسره بضاعة والله عليم بما يعملون وشروه بثمن يغش دراهم معدودة وكانوا فيه من الزاهدين وقال الذي اشتراه من مصر لامرأته أكرمي مثواه عسى أن ينفعنا أو نتخذه ولدا وكذلك مكنا ليوسف في الأرض ولنعلمه من تأويل الأحاديث والله غالب على أمره ولكن أكثر الناس لا يعلمون صدق الله العلي العظيم.
Today we're very fortunate to have Dr. Marie Rodet, who will be speaking to us about the history of Islamization in Mali. Let's welcome her with a round of applause.
First slide.
Dr. Marie is a reader in the history of Africa at SOAS. She's an expert of French-speaking West Africa with an MA in politics and a PhD in African studies.
Hello everyone, I'm very glad to be with you here tonight, especially in a live event. I haven't been at a live event for ages, so I might not be used to it anymore, so bear with me. So my talk today will be about the history of Islamization in Mali. Mali is really my field of research, the history of Mali. I work more on modern Mali, 19th, 20th century, but I also teach pre-colonial history, including the history of Islam in West Africa. And so what I will try to do today in 45 minutes is to tell you a bit about this history of Islam in West Africa and in Mali in particular. It's quite challenging, as you can imagine, because it's a very long history. But Even if I don't have the time to tell everything I've planned to tell you tonight, in the discussion, if you think, if there is something you think you want to know more about and I didn't have the time to tell you much about, please don't hesitate to ask me anything. I'll try my best to answer your questions. So if we go to the next slide, yeah, that's my outline for today, with a brief introduction, and then we'll have, I will go into this great history of the great medieval empires in West Africa, which are Ghana, Mali, and Sangai. Then I will briefly talk about the slave trades and the importance of the slave trade in the region. And we'll move to the 19th century jihads. Then, if we have time, we'll look into French colonization and how they approach Islam in West Africa and in Mali in particular. And again, if we have time, we'll talk about Islam and politics in Mali, in post-colonial Mali, and the situation in Mali today. So if we can get to the next slide. So much of what we know about the early history of West Africa comes from first medieval accounts written by Arab and North African geographers and historians. Most of them never traveled to West Africa, but it's through traders that they collected information and wrote what are known as chronicles. There are also a number of archaeological data and, of course, oral traditions. I will talk more about the first two ones today, but I'm happy if you have any question about oral traditions to tell you more about that. So it's through these different sources and with a special focus on the history of Islam in West Africa that we will explore today the history of Mali. With first a look, as I was saying, at the history of the great medieval African kingdoms, Ghana, Mali, and Sangai, and the slave trade. Then the reformist Islamic movements of the 19th century, French colonization in the 20th century, and finally the post-colonial era. Next slide, please. So around the 8th century, Arab documents mentioned ancient Ghana, which has nothing to do with what is Ghana today, but that's the historical name of this medieval empire. And probably Ghana, today's Ghana, chose to keep this name as a reminder of this great history, West African history, but it's not located, you'll see on the next slide, but let's keep this slide for now, that it's not located in the same region, exactly in West Africa. So, it's foremost Arab documents which mention first ancient Ghana, and that Muslims crossed the Sahara into West Africa for trade. North African and Saharan merchants traded salt, horses, dates, and camels from the north with gold, timber, and foodstuff from regions south of the Sahara. Next slide. So you can see on the map the great medieval empires. Ghana first, that's the yellow one. Then Mali, the blue one, and Sangai, the red one. So as you can see, Ghana, the yellow one, is not located at all where Ghana is today. That's just historical Ghana. The Ghana Empire was located at the crossroad of a number of trade routes between the West Africa savanna and forest zones and the trans-Saharan trade routes. And this specific location allowed its expansion, increasingly integrating the Muslim merchant scholar class while remaining a non-Muslim empire. Indeed, Islam facilitated long-distance trade by offering useful sets of tools for merchants, including contract law, credit, and information networks. Muslim merchant scholars also played an important role as advisors and scribes. They had the crucial skill of written script, which helped in the administration of the empire. Many Muslims were also religious specialists whose amulets were prized by non-Muslims. So Ghana was not, the kings of Ghana never converted, but they used Muslim scholars and merchants for trade and trade networks and for their skills as scribes. Very often, when we talk about Ghana, we talk about what is called the dual city. It was to organize that in the capital city of Ghana. Basically, the Muslim merchants will just be allowed to camp at the outskirts and remain at the outskirts. And they will just be in contact, but they will not be living in the city center, which will remain non-Muslim. The empires of Mali and Sangai. So the Mali Empire, 1215 to 1450, rose out of the region's fighting kingdoms. At its height, the Empire of Mali composed most of modern-day Mali, Senegal, parts of Mauritania, and Guinea. That was the biggest empire of these three, geographically, of these three empires. It was a multi-ethnic state with various religious and cultural groups. Muslims played a prominent role in the court as counselors and advisors, while the empire's founder, Sundiata Keita, was not himself a Muslim. By 1300, Mali kings became Muslim. The most famous of them, and I'm sure, there was a kid earlier on who asked me if I will be talking about him, who was the most famous king of the Mali Empire after Sundiata Keita, of course, not the founder. Have you heard of Mansa Musa? It's always, yeah, great. Yeah, well, he has different names, but usually he's called he's called Mansa Musa in the literature. But so he reigns from he reigns in the 14th century, early 14th century. So why is he so well known? Have you heard of his story? Yeah. Yeah, and when, yeah. And why? How come that he became so well known beyond West Africa? Do you know why? Except from trade. Yeah. Well, but how did we know about that? Yeah. Yeah. And where? Whereabouts? Where did he go with all this gold?
It's because he made this big hajj and he brought lots of people and he brought lots of gold to share out.
Yeah, exactly. On his way to Mecca, on his pilgrimage to Mecca, he did a stopover in Egypt and he arrived with so much gold. It's what has been remembered. We don't exactly know if it's exactly what happened, but it's how it has been remembered. So he came, he displayed his wealth and spent lavishly. Apparently, spending devalued the price of gold in Egypt for several years, and that's why he's so well known. It's so well. It's a shame I forgot to add this picture, which is very well known, of Mansa Musa on a map, on an Andalusian map, where he's in the middle of West Africa, on a West African map with a gold scepter. And so it was, because of what happened in Egypt, it became even known up to, in Europe, and it was so it was a symbol of West Africa and gold of West Africa. So Ibn Battuta, who is I don't know if you ever heard of Ibn Battuta, who traveled. Yeah.
I've heard of him.
Yeah.
One of those travelers who travelled around the world and made hajj.
Yeah.
Many different countries and learned.
Yeah. Where was he from?
I don't know that.
North Africa. Yeah. Yeah. What do you?
Nobody travelled as far as him until trains were invented.
Yeah, that's right. Well, it's what he wrote in his chronicles, that he traveled all this way. And he traveled to West Africa, he traveled on the East African coast, he traveled up to India. He was a world traveler really for this time. So Ibn Battuta visited Mali, actually, shortly after Mansa Musa's death. And this is how we have some information from his writings about the situation in Mali. It's quite interesting to read, even if, of course, he's a man of his time. So what he's interested in is proving that Islam is expanding up to these regions. And on one hand, because as I said, he's interested mostly in showing that Islam is well expanded. He praises a lot the country, the kings, for being good Muslim. But at the same time, he's also very critical of what he sees as remaining pagan beliefs. And so just to say, it's important. If you happen, it's easy to find. It's been well translated into English. If you happen to read him, of course you have to. He's a man of his time, and he comes from a specific background with a specific ideas about the world he travels to. By the 15th century, however, Mali dissolved largely due to internal dissent and conflicts with the tyrant Tuareg. And just to, when you think of West Africa, the Sahel, and Mali in particular, you have an idea of maybe large empty places. Mali is very wild. I don't know how many square kilometers it is, but you have the far north, which is a desert, and then the Sahel and a bit of Guinean forest. But actually, if you can move to next slide, please. And maybe, I don't know if you can click on the link which is below the picture. Yeah, it's to show you how urbanized Mali was at the time. I don't know if we can hear it. You wouldn't imagine. You think of these countries like very rural and a lot of small villages.
Agriculture to develop. The river was a long-distance trade route connecting the myriad communities along its banks. The Niger River rises in the hills of what was once the ancient kingdom of Fouta-Djallon, 150 miles from the West African coast. And but for a quirk of geology which caused the river to flow inland, the Niger would have been a very short river instead of one of the world's longest. Nearly 3,000 miles long, the river first flows north towards Timbuktu. It then curves eastward before turning southeast through Nigeria to the Atlantic Ocean. Between Vienna and Timbuktu, the Niger is yielding new revelations to equal the discovery of the manuscripts. From as early as 500 BC, this area was one of the most densely urbanized parts of the world, rivaling other early urban civilizations, such as Mesopotamia. Doug Park is part of an American team that over recent years has extensively surveyed the region's wealth of archaeological sites. When we met, Doug was about to begin excavating a huge city site 10 miles south of Timbuktu. So how typical is a site like this in Mali? How many might there be?
Well, there is a lot. And there are accounts that say that if someone from Jenny wanted to send a message to a village or a city a few hundred kilometers away, you just had to shout, and the message would be carried across the floodplains and along the Niger until it reached that village, because so many people were living in such proximity. Yeah.
So the picture at that time was just of, it was an urban landscape, all along the borders, the borders of the Niger River. So read this landscape for me.
Here, what you look for are these gray areas.
Yeah, where it looks kind of earthy.
That is massive pottery carpet. It spreads around an area somewhere between 70 and 100 hectares.
Which is enormous.
It's massive. This city rivals the size of the great cities of Mesopotamia, like Uruk.
So how does that compare to modern Timbuktu?
Well, to the old Medina of Timbuktu, it's maybe twice the size. And if you put that in comparison to the size of Timbuktu in regards to the rest of the world's cities during the Middle Ages, Timbuktu was somewhere around twice the size of London.
Timbuktu is twice the size of London.
And this site is twice the size of Timbuktu.
Wow. One fascinating fact to emerge is that these people lived together peacefully for centuries. Now that looks very much like a skull.
That is a skull. What we can tell from it is that we know it's probably not going to be an Islamic burial because its head is facing south.
So would he have definitely been in a grave?
Yeah, he was definitely...
You can tell he was buried as opposed to fell there.
Well, yeah, it's a good question.
Fell in battle.
Well, we don't really find any evidence for warfare in West Africa during the pre-Islamic period, and we're not really quite sure why that is. Peaceful society, we don't know. The general practice would have been is to bury the dead underneath the floor of the house.
Oh, I see. It's granddad under the house.
Yeah, good old granddad under the house.
So, are you going to excavate him, or are you going to leave him?
No, he's far too fragile to excavate.
So you're going to leave him to rest in peace?
For a while.
Okay. Do you want to show me the rest of the site?
Sure, I would.
These densely packed, interdependent communities each had a specific skill base. Some were farmers, others fishermen. There were potters and metal workers. Their activities cleared forests that once covered this landscape.
Some iron slab. And see here, this is a byproduct of iron smelting. Now, if you can imagine, the amount of wood to make charcoal to fire the furnaces to melt the iron ore is an immense amount of wood.
So there must have been trees. There must have been a lot of trees.
Especially African hardwood trees, and you only have acacia, and that's it. So,
and as a result of the smelting?
Absolutely.
Much of the pottery carpeting this site served the same purpose as our tin cans and plastic bags.
Oh, this is a pestle.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I put the one hand. Yeah. This one's pretty well made.
Some things don't change.
No, they stay the same for the most part, at least some of the real basic stuff. So, I mean, we're getting, oh, here, look, here's a grindstone here. As you see, these two are probably together.
Doug has described a cityscape whose architecture would have looked much like the villages still dotted around Timbuktu. It's just the density that's changed. It's amazing to learn that right here on this spot, there once existed a civilization 2,000 years ago, as old as Christianity, the size of which rivaled modern Timbuktu over there, and in terms of its antiquity, Timbuktu and the manuscripts dating back to the 11th century are beginning to look relatively, well, modern.
Thanks. So that was about the time of or shortly before the Mali Empire, time between Ghana Empire and the Mali Empire. And then emerging from the ruins of the Mali Empire, the Sangai Empire from the 1430s to 1591, ruled over a diverse and multi-ethnic empire. If you can come back to the slides, maybe. Yeah, next slides. Yeah. It's really when Islam became a state religion. But even if Islam was a state religion, the majority of the population still practiced their local belief systems. Islam was far from experiencing linear development in the region at the time. That's why we have to be careful with terms like Islamization. We think like linear development from 0 to full population being Muslim. But for example, Soni Ali, the ruler of Sangai from 1465 to 1492, persecuted Muslim scholars, particularly those who criticized local religious practices. It's really under Askia Mohammed, 1493-1529, that the Sangai's borders extended far beyond any previous West African empires. And it's under his patronage that Islamic institutions and public buildings like mosques and libraries were sponsored. And one notable example is a great mosque of Jenne, which was built in the 12th or 13th century, which is World Heritage today. It's unclear to what extent it looked like this at the time. We don't have pictures. I know that it was rebuilt partly under the colonial era, and they may have had their own understanding of how it had to look like, but we cannot be sure about that. Next slide. Though by the 16th century, still under the Sangai Empire, there were several centers of trade and Islamic learning in the Niger Belt region, most notably the famed Timbuktu. Arab chroniclers tell us that the pastoral nomadic tribe founded Timbuktu as a trading outpost, and it soon became a multicultural city, regional trade center, and a center for Islamic scholarship, which fostered a cosmopolitan environment. So in 1325, the city's population was around 10,000, but in the 16th century, the population is estimated to have been between 30,000 and 50,000. Timbuktu attracted many scholars from throughout the Muslim world. Less known than Timbuktu is Gao, which was actually next slide, which was actually the capital of the Sangai Empire. And there, archaeological excavations give us a lot of evidence as well about the spread of Islam in the Gao region since its foundation. Probably, we're not sure when Gao was founded, but around maybe the 7th, 8th century. So the excavations show a number of evidence like trade goods, cemeteries, architecture, personal possessions, and food refuse. And this can help us to understand the trade relations with North Africa at the time of the Sangai Empire. Through this archaeological evidence, you find traces of conversion to Islam prior to or about the beginning of the 10th century. no, you don't find any traces, evidence for conversion of Islam. But still, from the 10th century, you start finding evidence, which is very early on in the history of Islam for West Africa. So it's there after the 10th century that you start finding glazed pottery, glass vessels, glass beads, and brass metal work goods obtained via Muslim who controlled trans-Saharan trade directed through North Africa and Egypt. And you start also to have, from this time, evidence such as mosques, Muslim burials, and the remains of domestic structures that might have been built according to Muslim social requirements. One of the most fascinating evidence that prove really the trade and the links between trade and also Islam, and how it was controlled by the elite, the trade, is you find various inscribed Muslim tombstones that date from 1100 to 1300, and like this stela, which is an imported one, ready cut from Muslim Spain in the early 12th century. So you can imagine the extent of the trade routes and how Gao, the capital city of Sangai, was connected to these trade routes to North Africa and beyond North Africa in Muslim Spain. So the Sangai Empire ended when Morocco conquered the state in 1591. And the fall of the Sangai marked the decline of big empires in West Africa. Next slide, please. So all the major medieval empires that I mentioned before developed because they were in control of the trade routes. They managed to be, at this crossroad, as I was saying, between, this Sahelian crossroad between the Trans-Saharan, the Trans-Saharan trade routes and the Guinean forest belt. But the Trans-Saharan trade was not all about gold, cereals, and goods, but also about the slave trade. We have little odd evidence of the number which were traded, number of slaves who were traded across the Sahara. There is an estimation that from the 10th to the 19th century, circa 6,000 to 7,000 slaves were transported north each year. Slaves were purchased from black slave dealers in West African regions, including Mali, and they were sold into slavery as a result of a defeat in internal warfare most of the time. The captives, they could be sold internally or externally, including North Africa, and increasingly from the 16th century to the coast, and then, of course, into the trans-Saharan slave trade. So there is an interesting controversy linked to the history also of the Sangai, of the end of the Sangai Empire. I don't know if you have ever heard of Ahmed Baba, who was a great scholar from Timbuktu. Ahmed Baba, little is known about his life, except that he was probably from a prominent religious lineage. He was born north of Timbuktu and then later on moved to Timbuktu, where he was trained in Islamic studies and became a great scholar himself. But when, as I said, Morocco defeated Sangai in 1591 and invaded Timbuktu, and it's when Ahmed Baba was captured and transported to Morocco as a captive. And And it's from this time that we know about his early writings, and especially legal opinion, which he issued on the topic of slavery in a series of correspondence with Yusuf al-Isi. We don't know much about him. Actually, we don't know anything about Yusuf al-Isi, but he's the correspondent of this exchange of letters and legal opinion with Ahmed Baba. And this exchange clearly took place while Ahmed Baba was in captivity in Marrakesh. And it provides valuable insight into the intersection of two distinct intellectual and legal domains. Yusuf al-Isi is asking Baba about his people in the land of Islam, in the land of Sudan, Dar al-Sudan, and whether people there can be bought, sold, and owned, referring to previous rulings by scholars on the matter. And Ahmed Baba actually, in his response, lists a number of groups that are known to be Muslims and others who are considered to be non-believers and therefore permissible to be enslaved. So Ahmed Baba, in his response, tried to make a case about the fact that in the land of Sudan, in the land of the black, in Sudan, there are Muslims, and that they cannot be considered as enslavable because they are Muslim. Even, I mean, the undergoing how can I say, the underneath expectation from the one who asked the question, who is probably Moroccan, but we are not sure, is that there is an equation between black kafir, land of the Sudan. And Ahmed Baba clearly makes, of course, a case. Well, he's from the region, and he's a great scholar of Islam, and he's trying to make a case that there are populations in the land of Sudan who belong to the land of Islam, because they are Muslim. And he makes a number of distinctions, even between saying that some are also non-Muslims, but as they are under the protection of the Sangai, they cannot be enslaved. While some others are known as, are said to be Muslims, but they are not proper Muslims, so they could be enslavable. So it's interesting that as far as the 16th century, through this correspondence of legal opinion, we get this this idea. I mean, of course, it has to be replaced in this time period and this specific time. But there are these interrogations about who is Muslim, and therefore who belongs to the land of Islam, to Islam, and there is a kind of cultural clash here between Ahmed Baba, who is captive in Morocco, who is from Timbuktu, who, as I explained before, Timbuktu, which has grown as a great center of Islamic scholarship, but which is not that well known as a center of Islamic scholarship, apparently in other part of North Africa. And therefore, so he's not discussing whether slavery is not disputing the fact that people can be enslaved, is disputing who can be enslaved. So from this exchange, we understand that at the time, the first idea, the Moroccan practice of enslaving was to assume that blacks were non-Muslim, and that was fair game to enslave them, and that it was distinctly some sort of frontier world, not really belonging to the of Al-Salam, but actually Ahmed Baba, because of this encounter, try to make a case against this view. I won't spend much more time on this history of slavery linked to the trans-Saharan trade, but the Atlantic slave trade developed a bit later, but it will eventually be by far the largest and have the greatest impact, with more than 12 million transported. Yeah.
So
sorry.
They transported 63,000 slaves during their time?
No, I said 6,000 to 7,000 a year, probably over 9th century.
7,000 a year. If it's 9 years, then it would be
9th century, yeah. Well, the problem is it's very difficult to get figures. They are just estimates, and this doesn't include the Indian Ocean trade. So.
Ansar slave did that, then they've done either 54,000.
Yeah. But it's on a far longer period of time. But yeah, no, it was an important trade, definitely. And it shaped a lot the view of Africanness in North Africa until today. Unfortunately, some words, derogatory word to call sub-Saharan African in North Africa are the same as the word slave, as you may know. But just to say that anyway, that was a continuum. So there were black slave traders in contact with trans-Saharan slave traders, but increasingly also in contact with, on the coast, with European slave traders. The transatlantic slave trade was abolished 1807 by the British and gradually by other European empires. But the impact is important, even if, as you can imagine, Mali as an inland country was not directly impacted, because in comparison with coastal country also. What is clear with the expansion of the transatlantic slave trade is that the whole economy and trade became to be centered along the coast, the Guinean coast, and so the locus of power shifted. That's not probably by chance that actually after the fall of the Sangai Empire, you didn't have any big empire kingdom emerging. Later on, at the time of the Atlantic slave trade, because most of the powerful kingdoms emerging were actually on the coast, the ones trading into the Atlantic. So you really have this shift in the locus of power towards the coast of West Africa, and therefore, basically, the history of Mali and other Sahelian countries and regions a bit disappearing in the world history at the time, behind the Atlantic slave trade. But nonetheless, the slave trade, the internal slave trade, continued. and as I will explain to you in a minute, there were a number of internal wars in West Africa in the 18th and 19th century, including jihads, which produced captives and therefore slaves. And as the Atlantic slave trade was gradually abolished, actually, the demand for slaves on the coast decreased, gradually decreased, and what there were still internal wars happening in the Sahel. So they were producing slaves, captives who could not be that more easily sold towards the coast. So probably by the end of the 19th century, there were never as many slaves internally in the Sahel. There was a sporadic trade also continuing across the Sahara until the early 20th century. You could have still slave markets in Morocco, for example, with sub-Saharan African being sold. But by the end of the 19th century, most of Mali contained very large slave populations. In some places, as much as 30 to 60% of the whole population was considered slave. 1905, the French abolished the slave trade, internal slave trade, and then internal slavery. But still nowadays you have legacies of this history. That's part also of my own research, but we can talk about this later. But just to come back to the situation in the 19th century, just before the French actually colonized most of West Africa, including Mali. Next slide. Most of these conflicts occurred in areas not yet dominated by the French, who will only later come into contact with states created by these jihads. The first of them, for what is today Mali, was led by Sekou Amadou Barry in Massina. This is in central Mali. He saw himself as a Western extension of Ousmane Dan Fodio's jihad. Ousmane Dan Fodio from northern Nigeria, the first jihad in the 19th century in West Africa. By 1820, he had opted for an independent Islamic state called the Caliphate of Amdoulaye. And then later on, El Hadj Oumartal who was a Halpula Tukulur from the Senegambia region, from the Senegalese River at the border of what is today Mali and Mauritania. So from the 1850s to the 1860s, he conquered 3 Bambar kingdoms in Mali. He was ultimately defeated by the French in western Mali in 1857, and his sons were also further defeated in the 1880s. His followers ultimately fled westward, spreading the influence of the Tijani order in northern Nigeria, for example. So both jihads were led by Muslims who were of Sufi tradition, but they still launched the most important jihads in 19th century West Africa. And there are still references in today's West Africa, especially El Hadj Oumartal, who is more well-known than Sekou Amadou Barry, well, Sekou Amadou Barry is known mostly in central Mali. He didn't go beyond central Mali. Well, the history of El Hadji Oumar Tall is between Senegal and Mali, so it's more extended and more shared among these two countries. Just to say that West Africa had its own history of jihads, and they don't need to go far beyond West Africa to look for. I mean, you have unfortunately terrorist movements in Mali. I mean, one which is now dissolved, but Mujao, who conquered Gao in 2012, and they were proud to say that, I mean, they saw themselves as the descendants of these great jihads of the 19th century. And especially of the two I mentioned, of the two jihad leaders, El Hadji Oumar Tall and Sekou Amadou Barry. So that's, again, this backdrop that actually the French began to colonize West Africa. Next slide. It's really I mean, at first they were, the French were mostly on the coast of Senegal, but it's from the late 1880s that they start really to advance into the interior of West Africa. And that's often, I mean, colonization arrived relatively late in this. What was before was influence and trade and European presence, but on the coast only. They never really managed to reach and to conquer the interior of West Africa until the industrial revolutions in Europe allow them to have more gun power and to be at their advantage military. And there were resistance, of course, against colonization in what is today Mauritania, but also in Mali and Niger until the 1920s. And all these countries became independent in 1960. So when the French embarked on the colonial conquest of this region, they, as I mentioned before, they encountered reformed Muslim states, which initially offered some resistance, but ultimately succumbed to superior French military and economic power. And the French actually tried to make sense of Islam in this context. They came at the time, the previous experience was with Algeria, that they conquered from 1830, where they encountered fierce resistance, especially Muslim resistance, and they forged an idea of this North African super aggressive Islam that they increasingly, what they call Islam Blanc, white Islam, that they compared, they couldn't help but from comparing with the kind of Islam that they believe they found in West Africa, which they called Islam Noir. Of course, they encountered at first resistance, but not as fierce, I mean, de facto, because of the military and economic power. The populations, I mean, they were divided also. They had been undergoing internal wars for how many decades. They were not as strong as if it was a first encounter with any kind of enemies. It's in this context that, as I said, the French forged their own idea of what Islam in West Africa was, and what they called Islam Noir, as a sort of Islam which will be more peaceful and intertwined with local beliefs. And it's also because when they came, especially in Senegal, but even in Mali, they saw the Muslim Brotherhoods, the Tijaniya, and also increasingly the Muridiya, which appeared as forces for peace and stability rather than resistance. That's the way they saw them, and how they could rely on them to master the country, the region, and so they opposed these so-called peaceful Sufi brotherhoods with what they saw as a fanatic Islamic trend of the 19th century that El Hajj Omar Tal seemed to represent, but he was defeated anyway. So what they tried to do is to appropriate these structures by integrating them into the French system of colonial administration. They committed themselves to the free exercise of Islam, they respect for Islam demanded respect for Muslim law. So it led to the incorporation of Muslim courts into the colonial administration of French possessions of West Africa. They try, for example, to incorporate Cadi justice into the colonial order. But by trying to integrate, also they couldn't be neutral. And of course, at the end of the day, they were the ultimate power, and they were the one who decided how the system should work. And then, for example, when they were in Algeria, they started making a translation of the Maliki law, what they saw as the Maliki law, from Arabic into French, and this translation which was used later on in West Africa in the Cadi courts, which were under the authorities of the French power.
Dr. Marie, is it possible to wrap up quick?
Yeah, sure.
Is it okay just to ask some Q&A now, or a few more minutes?
Yeah, no, just to say that, just one word about that. We, as you see, and that will be my conclusion maybe. There is a slow influence and incorporation of Islam in West Africa along the centuries, from the 10th to the 19th century, with an acceleration in the 19th century. But actually, paradoxically, it's under colonial rules that you have the most acceleration of Islamization, because internal wars stop. There is the development of roads, of the railway, and people travel even more than before. And you have the development of Islamic spheres in the cities. And as I said, the Muslim Brotherhoods are more or less protected depending how they serve the colonial authorities. There are some conflicts sometimes, but there is this Islamic sphere developing. I'm not saying that the French were kind; they were not kind with the populations. But paradoxically, you will expect that because that's colonization, there is a retreat of Islam and the fight against Islam. Well, actually, de facto economic development, more or less, and a kind of time of without war saw the expansion of Islam. So in the beginning of the 20th century, you may have in some regions of Mali maybe a maximum of 15% of the population who was officially Muslim. And you have in the 1960s already 40 to 50%. So you see the expansion. And today, 90%, 93%. So as planned, I don't have the time, unfortunately, to explain everything I wanted to let you know about the history of the Islamization of, and especially the post-colonial era. But if you have any questions, especially, I'm sure you're intrigued and interested in the current situation, even if I'm not a specialist of all the terrorist movements in northern Mali, but I'll try my best if you have questions.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Any questions from either side?
Yeah. Okay. That's fine.
Quick question from me. When you spoke about the fact that slavery was, at one stage was 30%, I think, of Mali's population.
Yeah.
How did that survive? Like, were there revolts and stuff at that time? Did that? How is that's a real large number.
So there was resistance, but and I've worked on that actually on the resistance and populations escaping, building some sort of maroon societies, independent villages, but they continued to be largely socially and economically isolated. The dominant ideology remained one of a slave society. And you still have the legacies today. So it's still a taboo. It's a shame to say your ancestors were slaves. Nobody will admit that, except maybe in the villages where you have this history of resistance. Their ancestors fought against slavery. But this is little known, and anyway, nobody wants to hear this history. So to the extent that, I mean, why in some villages and in big cities, this legacy has partly disappeared. The problem is that in some others it hasn't. And until today you have discrimination. It's more than just a caste system. Well, there is a ban on intermarriages with other people of what is called the nobility, for example. But it's more than just endogamy, an issue of endogamy. It's an issue of systematic discrimination, marginalization, humiliation, and even more recently, violence against those who want to change that. And there's been even people who were killed a year ago because they didn't want to be called slave anymore. So, and I mean, the way it is that the ruling class is saying this is not slavery, it's custom. But of course, and these are the ones who are listened to by the authorities. So when the crisis happened, when people were molested and even killed, there was it was very difficult for the state to recognize what was happening, because they will tend to say, well, this is custom, it's these populations rebelling against the custom, it's the ones who are at the origin of disruption and violence. Well, they were the one victims of violence for centuries. It's changing slowly, but this is a very difficult and tricky situation. And this is not specific to Mali. You see that in all countries of the Sahel. And I'm talking now about, I'm not talking about just slavery between, let's say, the Tuareg and the so-called black population, or the Bidan and the black population. I'm talking about slavery between black populations.
Thank you very much. Dr. Jamil?
In one of your slides, you referred to a caliphate.
Yeah.
I think it was by Hamido.
I mentioned it for Ousmane Dan Fodio. No. Was it?
No. Yeah. It was like a Malian-based resistance.
Oh yeah, Sekou Amadou.
Right.
Yeah.
So my question was, what was their vision of a caliphate? And were there any links of allegiance to the Ottoman Caliphate?
I'm not an Islamic scholar, so that would be difficult for me to answer their own worldview and their own understanding of. But I know that there were correspondence, at least clearly with northern Nigeria. I don't know to what extent beyond that, but it's clear that all these people, before beginning their so-called jihad, they will go on a pilgrimage to Mecca, and we can imagine that it's a very long pilgrimage, it takes years, and that they are then in contact at the time in the 19th century with when they go to Egypt. But most of the links are clearly regional, and there are correspondences, and on their way back, Sekou Amadou as well as El Hadj Omar Tall made also a stopover in northern Nigeria.
I just want to make one more comment on slavery.
Yeah.
Say in the context of Sudan, you had someone like Zubair Pasha, who was a well-known trader, merchant mogul of his time. And in his accounts, when he needed to raise an army to protect his trade routes, the captives, the West would call them slaves, but in that culture, they were conscripted soldiers, and they got more rights, and they got a livelihood in that role. So there's a different way of looking at what we term slavery in that context.
Yeah, and actually you had kind of the same in West Africa with one of the great warlords of the late 19th century, Samori Touré, recruited conscripts in his armies, but they were called Sofa. But they were actually slaves, but they were soldiers, and they had a specific role. And in Morocco, that's the same. You had this great army and many of them were actually black Africans. That's the tricky thing about slavery. That was never, the enslaved were never a homogeneous category. You had different roles. And that was also ideologically a good way of preventing a revolt. If people were not unified and not treated the same, you could use, for example, you see that in West Africa, but that's the same in North Africa. that they will use other slaves who had a better position to persecute the ones who were rebellious. So it was a way of dividing to better reign. And there was some form also of incorporation. But this is not an homogeneous category, neither an homogeneous category nor an homogeneous history. So it's interesting to try to understand under which condition sometimes you have revolts which happen, and sometimes you don't have any revolts. And I'm trying to understand that, for example, for West Africa and especially Mali, because what we see now is a rise in violence and opposition against the legacies of slavery. And for decades, you didn't have that, or not to this extent. You had that 100 years ago, 200 years ago. So trying to understand under which political, socio-economic circumstances, how come that at some point you have a number of the so-called enslaved who decide that they are not satisfied with this situation and who come together to resist and to rebel. Yeah. I mean, you have today descendants of enslaved who claim, because they have this privileged position to be the advisors, the confidant of the rulers, of the ruling class, who will say, I'm very proud to be a slave. Here now, I'm ready to be naked to prove that. I mean, you have this kind of things happening in Mali today. And who say that they will always be proud to be slaves because they have a better position. They are in a privileged position compared to others. They are not the commoners' slaves.
Maybe slave is the wrong word to use.
I don't know, because that's a good question. How do you define slavery? How do you define freedom? The thing is, what I notice in Mali is that it's always the ruling class who today is trying to say it's not slavery and refuse to use this word, while the victims want the ruling class to stop calling them slaves because they continue to call them slaves, not in public outside the village, but there is a neighborhood in the village which is called the slave neighborhood. And this is the word, I mean, of course in English that's the word slave, but the local word, there is no ambiguity. It means slave, slavery. They use the equivalent. This is, I mean, they don't have, in this context, they don't have 100 different words to describe the same situation. They just have one. And this is really synonymous with slavery in English and esclavage in French.
Thank you very much. There are a couple of questions, but I want to ask them if they can come and talk to you directly afterwards, if that's okay?
Yeah, sure, sure.
So we're going to end there. Salawat. Thank you so much for speaking, and if you do have questions, Marie's around for a little bit afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Would you like sweetened tea or not sweetened tea?
Not sweetened, please.
Okay.